Battle of Midway. Part 2. Early on June 4, Nagumo launched the initial attack on Midway with 36 D3S, 36 B5NS, and 36 Zero fighters. Simultaneously, he launched 7 search aircraft. However, Japanese reconnaissance was insufficient, with too few aircraft to cover the assigned search areas. At 5:34, a PBY reported sighting 2 Japanese carriers, and another spotted the inbound airstrike 10 minutes later. Midway's radar detected the approaching enemy, and American interceptors were scrambled. The Japanese attacked Midway at 6:20, heavily damaging the U.S. base. Marine fighters led by Major Floyd B. Parks intercepted the Japanese and suffered heavy losses but managed to destroy some enemy aircraft. The Japanese attack did not neutralize Midway as expected. American bombers based on Midway made several attacks on the Japanese carrier force. Japanese losses during this attack included 11 aircraft destroyed, 14 heavily damaged, and 29 with some degree of damage. American bombers, including Grumman Avengers and B-20 SIXS, attacked the Japanese carriers but were repelled with losses. One B-26, piloted by Lieutenant James Murray, flew down the length of the Akagi, narrowly missing the bridge, and crashed into the sea. Another B-26, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays, crashed into the sea after being damaged by anti-aircraft fire. During these airstrikes, the American submarine USS Nautilus, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Brockman, was near the Japanese fleet. The submarine made 2 unsuccessful torpedo attacks, one on a battleship and another on a cruiser, while being pursued by Japanese escorts. The Battle of Midway was marked by intense air battles and attacks on both sides, with significant losses on both sides as well. In accordance with Yamamoto's orders for Operation MI, Admiral Nagumo had kept half of his aircraft in reserve, including 2 squadrons each of dive bombers and torpedo bombers. These planes were initially unarmed, as dive bombers were to be armed on the flight deck, and torpedo bombers were armed with torpedoes in case American warships were spotted. At 7:15, Nagumo ordered his reserve planes to be rearmed with contact-fused general-purpose bombs for use against land targets due to the attacks from Midway. However, at 7:40, a scout plane from Tone reported sighting a sizable American naval force to the east without specifying its composition. Nagumo initially reversed his order to rearm the bombers and demanded that the scout plane identify the American force. This delay caused further complications. It wasn't until later that the scout plane confirmed the presence of a single American carrier in the force, one of the carriers from Task Force 16. The other carrier was not sighted. Nagumo was now faced with a dilemma. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi recommended an immediate strike with the available aircraft from Hiryu and Soryu, along with half of the ready cover patrol aircraft. However, the returning strike force from Midway needed to land promptly, and the Japanese didn't have time to properly position their reserve planes on the flight deck for launch. Japanese naval doctrine preferred launching fully constituted strikes rather than piecemeal attacks. Nagumo was also concerned about launching aircraft without proper anti-ship armament and fighter escort. Additionally, the arrival of another land-based American airstrike at 7:53 reinforced the need to attack the island again. Ultimately, Nagumo decided to wait for his first strike force to land and then launch the reserve, which would be armed with torpedoes. However, this decision had significant consequences, as the American strike force was already en route and couldn't be stopped, and the delay allowed the American carriers to prepare for the impending attack. In hindsight, if Nagumo had launched the available aircraft around 7:45 and risked the ditching of Tomonaga's strike force, they could have formed a powerful and well-balanced strike package that might have been able to sink two American carriers. Nevertheless, by the time Nagumo made his decision, it was too late to prevent the American strike against his fleet. After the Americans had already launched their carrier aircraft against the Japanese, Admiral Fletcher ordered the launch of an attack against the Japanese, while initially keeping Yorktown in reserve in case other Japanese carriers were found. The American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, had to launch their planes into the wind, so a launch time of 7 o'clock was set to allow them to close the distance with the Japanese fleet. The first plane took off a few minutes after 7 o'clock from these carriers. Fletcher, after completing scouting flights, followed suit at 8 o'clock from Yorktown. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet faced challenges in coordinating their attacks due to the lack of time to pass lessons learned from previous battles. American squadrons were launched piecemeal and proceeded to the target in several different groups, causing a lack of coordination among the attackers. The American torpedo attacks on the Japanese carriers did not result in any hits but had significant consequences. They kept the Japanese carriers off balance, disrupted their preparations for a counterstrike, and depleted the Japanese combat air patrol of ammunition and fuel. The American dive bomber attacks that followed were more successful. Due to the miscommunication and misdirection of the American aircraft, they arrived at the perfect time and altitude to attack the Japanese carriers. This attack inflicted critical damage on the Japanese carriers Kaga and Akagi, eventually leading to their abandonment and scuttling. Overall, while the American attacks lacked perfect coordination, they disrupted the Japanese carrier operations and contributed to the eventual sinking of 3 Japanese carriers during the Battle of Midway. After suffering significant losses, the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu quickly launched 2 attack waves against the American carrier Yorktown. The first attack consisted of 18 D-3A dive bombers and 6 Zeros, and they hit Yorktown with 3 bombs, causing damage to the deck, disabling most of her boilers, and destroying 1 anti-aircraft mount. This forced Admiral Fletcher to move his command staff to the heavy cruiser Astoria. However, damage control teams managed to temporarily patch the flight deck and restore some of the boilers, allowing Yorktown to resume air operations. About an hour later, Hiryu's second attack wave, comprising 10 B-5N torpedo bombers and 6 escorting Zeros, arrived over Yorktown. The effective repairs on Yorktown led the Japanese pilots to mistake her for a different, undamaged carrier. They attacked and hit Yorktown with 2 torpedoes, causing her to lose all power and list to port at a 23-degree angle. Despite these attacks, the mistaken belief that each strike had sunk an American carrier boosted Japanese morale. They believed they could still muster enough aircraft for one more strike against what they thought was the only remaining American carrier. Late in the afternoon, a scout aircraft from the USS Yorktown located the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu. This discovery prompted the USS Enterprise to launch a final strike against Hiryu, consisting of 24 dive bombers. Despite strong defenses from over a dozen Zero fighters, the American attack was successful, with 4 or possibly 5 bombs hitting Hiryu, setting it ablaze and rendering it unable to operate aircraft. The USS Hornet strike, which was launched later due to a communications error, focused on the remaining escort ships but failed to score any hits. After futile attempts to control the fires on Hiryu, most of the remaining crew members were evacuated from the ship. The rest of the Japanese fleet continued sailing northeast to intercept the American carriers. Hiryu was later discovered early the next morning by an aircraft from the escort carrier Hosho, but before any salvage efforts could take place, the ship sank. Captain Yamaguchi, along with the ship's captain, chose to go down with the ship. As night fell, both sides made tentative plans for continuing the battle. Admiral Fletcher, unable to effectively command from the damaged Yorktown, ceded operational command to Admiral Spruance, who was determined to safeguard both Midway and his carriers. Fearing a night encounter with Japanese surface forces, Spruance initially withdrew eastward but later turned back west toward the enemy. Although both sides attempted to locate each other on June 5, they did not make contact. A late afternoon American strike mission failed to detect Yamamoto's main fleet. At 2:15 on June 6, the submarine Tambor sighted several ships but provided a vague report, causing confusion for Admiral Spruance. The ships spotted by Tambor were actually Japanese cruisers and destroyers sent to bombard Midway. They eventually retired to the west, leading Spruance to block that perceived threat. The battle continued over the next 2 days, with further strikes launched against straggling Japanese ships. Salvage efforts were made on the Yorktown, but it was torpedoed and sunk by the Japanese submarine I-168 on June 6. The USS Hammond, which had been providing auxiliary power to the Yorktown, was also torpedoed and sank. Yorktown remained afloat for a while but eventually rolled upside down and sank on June 7. The Japanese conveyed an incomplete picture of the battle's results to their military liaison conference on June 10. They maintained secrecy about the extent of their defeat, and Japanese news reported a great victory. Only the highest levels of the Japanese Navy and government were accurately informed about the carrier and personnel losses. This maintained a facade of strength within the Japanese military. Upon the return of the Japanese fleet to Hashirajima on June 14, the wounded were immediately transferred to naval hospitals and quarantined to keep the defeat secret. The remaining personnel were dispersed to other fleet units without being allowed to see their families or friends. None of the flag officers or staff of the combined fleet were penalized, and Nagumo, the mobile force commander, was later placed in command of the rebuilt carrier force. The defeat at Midway prompted changes in Japanese carrier operations, such as refueling and rearming more aircraft on the flight deck, adopting practices to prevent fuel fires, and redesigning new carriers with improved firefighting equipment. However, problems persisted in these areas, as evidenced by later carrier losses. In terms of personnel, replacement pilots underwent abbreviated training to meet immediate fleet needs, leading to a decline in the quality of aviators produced. This, along with the workload on veterans and a lack of rest opportunities, contributed to a deterioration in Japanese naval air groups during the war while American forces continued to improve. Thank you for watching.